Hi, I'm going to quickly show you a very simple tutorial on how to make the very popular yet very simple glowing swirl effect around a specified subject within Photoshop. Now, this can be achieved very easily, assuming that you know the following procedures. So first thing you need to do is set up your background color as black. So by default, when you start up Photoshop, it should be black as your foreground and white as your background. If it's not, then just click this little icon right here with the black as the front and white as the back, and it'll bring you something like this. Then click the arrows, and it should switch them around. Now that you have that ready, go to File, New, and set up your document size. For the subject that I'm going to be using, I need a 1500 by 1200 with a 72 pixels per inch ratio. I'm also going to need RGB color, which I'm assuming most of you will need too, unless you want to make a black and white swirl, with an 8-bit, and a background color as your background contents. Click OK. And this should give you something like this. Just a black screen. Double click on your background layer, which is by default created by Photoshop, and it'll give you something like this. Edit nothing in this box but the name and call this background. Click enter, and now you should have the background layer. Now the difference between the previous background layer and this background layer is the one that Photoshop gives you is not directly editable. For this program, we're not going to be needing, for this project, we're not going to be needing to edit it, but it's a good habit to get into to use that. Next thing you're going to need to do is go to New Layer, this little page icon right here, and rename the layer by double-clicking on its name. I'm going to name this Man, for my subject is a man. Now we'll go to File, Place, not Open. Open will put it in a new document, so you gotta go to Place, and choose an image. For me, mine is this one. Click enter, and you should have something like this. Now cut out your subject using your selection tool of choice, and then you'll be left with your subject. Something like this. So, now you should have a layer with your subject and a background layer. Create one more new layer, and that's all we're going to need. Call this new layer Swirl. I'm going to zoom in using the Control+ function. And now you're going to have to use your pen tool on the swirl layer in order to make it look like it's swirling. So use your pen tool, and I'm going to post another video. It's going to be down here in my description. And you can look at that, and it'll tell you how to use the pen tool if you do not already know. So let me just quickly do this. Alright, so as you can see, I've created a very simple squiggle using the pen tool. Now, what you're going to need to do is set up your brush and foreground color. I'm going to use a foreground color of blue. Now, your foreground color will determine the color of your swirl. You can always edit it slightly, but it'll determine the basic color. So I'm going to choose blue. Usually, I'd recommend choosing the topmost color. Now that your foreground color is set to blue, you got to set up your brush. Go to your brush tool and set it up. So I'm going to use a 5 pixel diameter with a hardness of 0. It's usually better to use a hardness of 0 and a 5 to 7 pixel diameter. 5 is pretty neat. So what you're going to do now is go back to your pen tool. Right-click, making sure that your swirl layer is selected. Right-click with your pen tool anywhere on the layer, and click Stroke Path. This should bring up a small box like this with just two options. Make sure Simulate Pressure is checked, and Brush is also there, because we set up our brush, and make sure Simulate Pressure is also checked again. And now click OK. Simulate Pressure, what it does is it makes sure that it fades out, and I'll show you what I mean. Right-click and click Delete Path. Now, if you notice, with Simulate Pressure, what happens is it starts from a really thin, small, faded line, and it goes thicker and thicker and darker until it goes back to a really small, thin, faded line. So now, what you're going to need to do is erase the appropriate parts of your swirl layer to make it look like the swirl is wrapping around them. So get your eraser tool and just erase the appropriate parts. So I'm going to quickly do that. Alright, so now as you can see, I've erased the appropriate parts to make it look like it's wrapping around him. When you do this, make sure that you leave appropriate parts when it's going through a space, like this. Now, once you have this, now it's just basically the effects that'll make it work. So double click on your swirl layer, just make sure it's not on the name, and it'll bring up a little layer style box like this. Use this to apply the effects. Go to drop shadow, and apply the following effects that'll make it look decent. You can always mess with these. Apply color dodge. Make sure it's on black. Make sure the opacity is on 75. Change the angle to 104. Make sure use global light is checked. Change the distance to 0. Change the spread to 51. And change the size to 16. Make sure the contour is this one right here. Make sure noise is on 0, and make sure layer knocks out drop shadow is checked. Time for inner shadow. Make sure it's on soft light as the blending mode. Black. 75, 104, 102, 100, 122. Make sure this is straight, and make sure noise is 0. Outer glow. Change the blending mode to screen. Opacity to 75. Noise to 0. Make this softer. Spread should be 0, size should be 5, contour should be straight, range should be 50, jitter should be 0. Change this here to a blue to white transparent gradient. It should be your foreground to transparent gradient. Click OK. And now you have something looking like this. Now this is starting to look kind of like a power beam. Now you got to apply an inner glow. Inner glow should be basically the same thing. Make it screen 75, 0. Change this here again to foreground to transparent. There you go. And the rest should be left the same. If you want, you can mess around with these here. I find that these don't make much of a difference in inner shadow, though, or inner glow. Next, we have 2 more to go. Satin. Change the color of satin to blue. You don't have to use satin. You can change it to whatever you want, but I'm going to use actually white, because white makes it brighter. Make the opacity whatever you feel suits you best. You can change the distance, size, and all that. And you can leave the contour the same. Last one we're going to use is color overlay. Change the color overlay to a very light shade of the color that you're using. For me, it's going to be a very light blue, almost white even. Like that. And make sure you look at your preview. Make sure preview is checked. And this looks pretty good. Mess with opacity and all. Click OK, and you should have something like this. Now, with a few more effects and changes, you can make some pretty good stuff, like this one. So, if you found this helpful, just don't forget to rate and subscribe, and thanks for watching.